All right, Zoe, appreciate it. Glad to jump into all this, but I think before jumping into anything else, would love to just get the lay of the land on Exante for the people that aren't as familiar. So, could you give us the elevator pitch, and also just talk about where you think the world is heading, and more specifically, what you're investing in?
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Clay. Yeah, Ante is a relatively new venture fund, and we have an unusual focus. We're focused entirely on technology that advances human agency and individual control over things like privacy, data, assets, algorithms, etc. And really, sort of with an eye towards how those types of technologies can help to counter the rise of digital authoritarianism. So things like surveillance, censorship, disinformation, and help to kind of advance democratic values in the world. I think stepping back for a second, and I say this kind of collectively, like I think we have a very good sense of what the authoritarian surveillance state model of technology looks like. The Chinas and Russias of the world have done a really good job perfecting that. And we don't really know what its inverse is, right? Like we haven't really articulated like what is the type of technology that ultimately makes democratic institutions and structures more resilient and robust. And that's effectively what we're trying to invest in. And our hypothesis is that it tends to be technology that's more private, more secure, more distributed. And so we cast a pretty broad net. We look at everything from cybersecurity to crypto and Web3 to data infrastructure, AI, dev tools, et cetera. So it's a very thematically focused fund, but then relatively kind of cross-cutting in terms of type of technology or sector. And then, you asked a question about where the world is going. We've been thinking about the challenges of authoritarianism for a long time. But if anything, I would argue that in the last couple of months, those drivers and kind of challenges have only intensified. I mean, if you look at everything from like, the trying to chart the fate of TikTok to, things like the mobile hack, Salt Typhoon to DeepSeek, et cetera. All of those I think are examples of the ways in which, the nature of global challenges or the nature of global conflicts is really evolving over time. And the technology that we build as the US to remain competitive needs to address those types of challenges. And that is that's software, right? So it's great that there are a ton of people thinking about how to keep the US strong and resilient and competitive from a kind of hardware perspective, drones, robotics, et cetera. Love that. But I think we're taking a slightly different angle and thinking about the ways in which geopolitical conflict is evolving on a forward-looking basis. And a lot of that will require tools that are especially, sort of private and secure, and give Americans more control over their data and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, it's unique to most, if not every other fund that I've talked to. I don't think a whole lot of other people are looking at the same stuff that you are. But I'm curious, because I mean, everybody has their own path to starting a fund. I'm just curious what your path was to A, understanding dark sides of modern tech, like the problem that you're solving, and B, deciding to build a fund around that thesis.
Yeah, so my background has been primarily in investing, and I, started my career at Goldman and spent time at the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector investment arm of the World Bank. But I became interested in a lot of these questions and challenges because earlier in my career, like particularly when I was at the World Bank, I did a lot of work in conflict zones. I lived in Iraq for a while in 2017, spent time in South Sudan and Somalia and DRC and places like that. And and just became very interested in all the intersections of geopolitics and national security and conflict, and the ways in which tech was being used on the ground, both in like empowering ways, like people were using secure communications or, or leveraging crypto, in very, kind of creative, resourceful ways. And at the same time, there was also like high degrees of surveillance and censorship and so forth. And that kind of dynamic and friction I found really, really fascinating, and definitely informed a lot of the kind of like big picture thinking that has gone into building ex ante. I think also, I spent some time, kind of in these defense sort of adjacent spaces, and I did observe the way in which a lot of folks became very focused on defense tech and dual use tech in a very kind of traditional way, and that it's very hardware focused. It's very focused on traditional defense contractor models, and yet I felt like the kind of interesting challenges that I was observing were outside of that paradigm. And I looked around and I thought, is anybody investing with this lens? And I couldn't find anybody. There were no firms that were, kind of uniquely focused on that. And I just really felt like it should exist in the world. And whether somebody else was going to build it or I was going to build it, it felt to me like, um, this was an important thesis to invest behind, both from the perspective of it being a unique moment in history and also a pretty unique market opportunity too that was largely being overlooked. So that was a lot of the motivation, for deciding to start a new fund in the space.
Yeah.
But it definitely is like an unusual point of view. It's a kind of provocative thesis. It's not everyone's cup of tea, not everybody understands it, and I'm totally okay with that. Like at least I like to say at least like we're a different flavor of tea. So that definitely is a big part of the DNA of ex ante.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree. I have a few thoughts. I think, have you met Tom So? He used to work at Dash Fund.
I don't think so.
He's a GP up in New York. He
Okay.
had a really good take that a lot of the best fund managers that he was friends with, they have orthogonal paths and they just don't
Yeah.
have this like linear path to being a venture investor. I think that's been proven over and over again. Um, and so I think having like these different lived experiences directly related to the problem that you're solving or investing in, like it's obviously a source of alpha. I'm just curious how
Yeah,
it
I
arrives at
totally. I think to generate alpha, you have to have a different point of view, right? Like there has to be an element of being a contrarian, and I think it's easier to have those points of view and perspectives, like if you are coming from a kind of outsider path or just a slightly different have had a slightly different set of experiences you know, than everybody else who's investing. So
yeah.
I agree with that.
Kind of related to that, how do you think about a person's path to investing and how that affects their judgment and risk tolerance? Related to that, how do you think about that like if that person's a founder, how do you think about it for them as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because I think in venture as a whole, I've often reflected on the fact that our entire industry is about risk taking, and yet I think a lot of people in VC in venture like are actually quite risk averse, right? At least in like their own kind of like personal lives and ability, like what they're kind of willing to do career wise. And so I have to say, oftentimes I feel like my day to day and kind of what I'm doing and building feels much more similar to a lot of the like early stage founders that I'm investing in than it does to, some of my friends who are venture investors, but at much bigger firms, because the whole thing is so scrappy and there's so much sort of uncertainty, and a lot of it is, kind of a lot of it's riding on your shoulders, and a lot of it is about like how do you take an idea like in a Google Doc and like turn it into something real in the world. And in that sense, like I think starting a fund and starting a company has a lot of there's some similarities there. But to answer your question more directly, I think I think it's a whole collection of like life experiences that contribute to somebody's, kind of like willingness to see, unexpected outcomes or to take a contrarian take or to just to be willing to take risk that others aren't. And so I'm very open-minded to like what is the correct path to becoming a venture investor? I don't, I think fortunately we're in a field that has proved that you can take a lot of different paths and be very, very good at this job and be a real, kind of world-class investor. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think risk aversion in venture is like always a funny topic to talk about.
Yeah.
I think you listen to some really smart people talk. I mean, Bill Gurley has a quote where there's only two types of errors in venture capital, and only one of them actually matters. So you can get it wrong like 99 times out
Yeah.
of 100. But like if you miss an investment that ends up being like 1,000x returner, that's the only one that actually matters in that
Yeah.
situation. So yeah, I don't know. It's like hard to relate to some of these people who just like love saying no to everything and like they pride themselves on like how selective they are. It's like, all right, like maybe that's great, but like, are you also saying no to too many good ideas? Maybe that's a separate thing.
Yeah. No, you have to be willing to to take a leap of faith, right? Because that ultimately is what really early stage investing requires, especially like the biggest and most ambitious ideas require the biggest leaps of faith. So,
Yeah,
I agree with that.
kind of related to that. This wasn't on the questions that I had sent over to you beforehand, but it's something I'm thinking about of just like what will happen to pre-seed capital in a world where it's just like incredibly easy to spin up an MVP because typically pre-seed capital is used to like
Yeah.
these ideas out into the world and like test demand. I would argue that if I mean, I can build apps in Replit and I was never taught how to code. Um, so I've been thinking through of like taking pre-seed capital now is just construed as negative signal. Um, that's like a very loaded question, but I'm just curious your take on it as somebody that spends a lot of time at like pre-seed and seed level.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think about it primarily from the founder perspective, which is like, I think the possibility of being able to spin up an MVP really easily and cheaply and without a lot of, you know, people and labor and so forth is like such a gift, right? Because it gives a founder or prospective founder the ability to really like test out their ideas and like market test them and figure out, like is there meat on the bones to like what they've been dreaming up in their heads, and get further down that path without having to necessarily commit to taking outside capital or to running their company in a particular way. And so my hope is that it just sort of expands the option set for somebody who wants to build something. And maybe their conclusion is like, oh, I actually can build this pretty cheaply, and maybe I can kind of bootstrap it to a point where, like venture is not, something that we want to pursue at all. And like maybe that's the right choice. And in 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been an option because the only way to even get to the MVP is to hire a bunch of developers and raise some amount of capital. So I think my hope is that it broadens the opportunity set for folks. Now, I think maybe what you're also asking is like, does it change then the bar for like what a pre-seed investment should be proving by the time they're raising money? I mean, I think we'll have to see a little bit. And maybe the idea of like raising entirely pre-product is something that over time becomes less and less common because people are able to spin up a product pretty quickly. But I think it also depends what you're building, right? Like if it's application layer tools and you're building an app, then yes, you probably can do that pretty easily, and that's amazing. Some of the things that we look at are very like very sophisticated from a technological standpoint, and so probably couldn't be spun up very quickly and cheaply. So I think it's going to depend a little bit, but that's generally how I think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. No, it's really interesting. Um, Switching gears again here, but we talked earlier about you being thesis driven, and I'm curious just talking to other thesis driven investors, like how they spend their day. Um, So like for you, could you just walk us through day in the life of Zoe as a investor? Like what are you doing? I guess maybe like through a week, like how you're splitting up your day, how much time is actually spent talking to founders versus doing all the million other things you got to be doing to keep the fund afloat.
Yeah, I mean, trying to do a really precise accounting of my day or week would be very challenging, but I will say, because I just feel like it's super variable, but I will say I think maybe as a more thesis-driven investor versus somebody who's a generalist and just entirely opportunistic, it always feels like a good use of my time to spend time with folks who are maybe like practitioners in the broader spaces that I'm interested in. And either that means they're operators and they've been building in that space, or maybe they're approaching some of these problems from like a research or academic perspective. Is very useful for me in helping to refine my thinking about a new domain, and to proactively, sort of uncover what some of the opportunities will be in that space, whether it's opportunities today or opportunities that we should be like horizon scanning for in the future. And I think if you're, I mean, maybe you do some amount of that, if you're entirely generalist too, but I think when you have a little bit more of a kind of a focus and a North Star, it does make sense to kind of, go deep and be very, kind of research oriented and research driven and so forth. And so one of the things like I think we've tried to encourage in the context of ex ante is that both myself and my colleague Michael have been co-authors on research papers and spent time in these kind of like more academic like headspaces than I think you know maybe folks at other firms would, because that would seem like a waste of time, right? And it's useful for us, I think. So that probably is where some of the differences come out.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I mean, I'm assuming that some of the things you're mapping out are kind of related to applied AI, AGI, I guess related to your overall thesis of dark themes in tech. How are you thinking about threats and opportunities of AGI? I feel like that's a very loaded question, but it's one that I'm just generally curious about because it's something I'm not spending
Yeah.
as much time thinking about. Um, so yeah, I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be honest, I don't find AGI to be like that helpful of a concept in thinking about like risks and opportunities. And I actually sometimes find myself wondering um if referring to AI as artificial intelligence, the way that we have named it and the nomenclature, and thinking about AGI as being kind of, like almost omnipotent or whatever, like is like not like actually makes it harder to be rational about what the actual like risks and opportunities are. Like at the end of the day, this is maybe going to sound kind of basic, but it's like AI is like fancy data science, right? And like sometimes I think if we were to frame it more in terms of like this is machine learning and it has these advantages and it has these weaknesses, like we could approach some of the challenges without so much like existential angst, right? But to answer your question more directly, I think that I tend to be a little bit more focused on the risks and opportunities that feel more proximate to us, as opposed to like really fixating on existential and catastrophic risk. I think that's important too. I'm glad that people are considering that. But to me, the kind of like failure modes of AI and how people are deploying it today, are abundant, and they might not rise to the level of being like catastrophic risk, but are going to determine the extent to which we incorporate AI tools and agents and co-pilots into our workflows or not. And that that matters a lot. So, the question that I like to think about more than, is AGI going to be, an advancement for humanity or the end of humanity, is like, is a separate question, which is like, is there like, how do you make, uh, what's the right way to frame this? Like, I want AI that makes humans more human. And like, what does that mean? And how do you get there? Right? Like humans have these like unique and innate capabilities, in spaces like creativity or introspection or like higher level thinking, etc. And like, what are the ways that we can deploy AI to elevate those unique qualities of what it means to be a human and do that in a really like safe and secure and, thoughtful way. And to me, that's like a much more exciting and interesting problem to think through than the kind of like big level existential problems.
I agree. And I think it's just like my take on it is ideally AI does exactly that, and it allows us more free time to do what we're best at, which is be creative, and it takes away all the admin and mundane tasks that nobody likes doing. And honestly, computers are better than us at doing. And so
Totally.
where AI gets a bad rap and where I get frustrated seeing all this on my timeline is these like AI ghostwriters or like AI generated content teams that are just pumping out garbage content that's clearly AI written.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to read it, but they're just doing it because it checks the box, and I guess it's like making their life easier. But I don't think that's the best applied use. But hopefully
Yeah.
that
And,
goes.
and what's tricky is when AI automates a task and therefore gives you like more time back, it's like, does that give you more, does that, as a user, like, does that give you more control or does that give you less control, right? And I think it kind of depends on the facts, like it depends on the circumstances. And ideally, we're in a world in which like it actually gives you more control because now you've automated away the things that, are not meaningful or don't matter or aren't gonna, like, or aren't that stimulating, right? To free you up to do the other portions of your work that are, but it's a kind of fuzzy line, right? Like I don't think it's that clear cut.
Right. I guess we'll see what
Yeah.
happens. It's interesting to follow. Um, what's one thing you wish you knew when you were starting Exante that you know now? If you can narrow it down to one.
Gosh, there are many. I think I had even though I have always had really high conviction in our kind of thesis and point of view, I think early on I did have some anxiety about coming out of the gate, like with a, really putting a stake in the ground and saying very clearly like what we stood for and what we cared about because the I think the impulse in VC is often to do the opposite. It's to try to like be everything to everyone. And that's why you have a lot of venture funds that kind of use this language like, you know, we back amazing founders changing the world, right? Like it
Hmm.
just ends up being so generic. And so, I both had conviction in the thesis and also like felt some anxiety about pursuing a kind of different path. And I guess if I could go back, I would tell myself like, no, that's totally the right choice. Like be true to who you are as a firm and an investor and that and there's no there's no advantage to trying to dilute that. So I
Right.
think that's what I would say.
Yep. Makes sense. What is the worst part about venture that nobody talks about?
Ooh. The worst part of venture. I think sometimes it can be hard to be introverted in venture.
Yeah. Totally.
It's just like an industry and a space that I think like really rewards like a lot of extroversion. And I would put myself like somewhere in the kind of middle. I wouldn't say I'm like, like extreme introvert, but I think a lot of the most thoughtful and brilliant investors that I know and respect often are like quieter and more more introverted and like a little more withdrawn. And sometimes I feel like the space um doesn't kind of like reward that archetype, right? Or like that it's like harder to succeed in that mode or it seems like it could be. So anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
that's one.
Like the best investors talk the least, the loudest ones get the microphone. which can be
Yeah, I
frustrating.
think that happens for sure, which is very different, by the way, than, like public markets investing, right? Like if you're running a hedge fund and you sit behind a Bloomberg terminal, like you can be totally silent and
But
be,
yeah,
the very top of your field. And and venture is just a different beast, right? So it doesn't seem it at least doesn't seem like you could do that, right? So that I've always found a kind of like interesting dynamic, particularly that surrounds this asset class versus other forms of investing.
yeah, I totally agree. I struggle with that myself. It's like, how do you, I mean, there's like such
Yeah.
an opportunity cost of not sharing your thoughts
Yeah.
online, but like at the same time, it's just like very out of my comfort zone to do it. But here we are recording a podcast, about to share
Yeah.
with people. Um, Last question I have for you is, and this might be hard to narrow down, but are there any other emerging managers that have really impressed you over the past few years?
Oh my God, so many. So many of them that are, our peers are also people that I learn from every day. But I would call out two that are solo GPs who are running really cool strategies. One of them you've had on the show before, which is Maya
He's,
Bakai, who runs Spice
he's
Capital.
super sharp.
And I think she just has a really kind of different perspective and really interesting background and I adore her. And also I don't think you've had her on, but Ashley Smith, who just recently announced the launch of her new fund, Vermilion. By the way, both of these are funds that are, like relatively small fund ones or fund twos, and I think they just have like really interesting and differentiated perspectives. So those are two that I would watch.
Sweet. Okay. I've not met Ashley. If you're open to making that intro, I can
Yeah,
do something. Maya, shout out Maya, super
yeah,
sharp.
yeah,
Very anti-consensus. She's like allergic
yeah,
to consensus, and I think that
yeah,
served really well.
which I love. Yeah.
Uh, well, cool, Zoe. This has been great. I will clean all this up, shoot it over to you, and
Awesome.
you get final say. But
Cool. No, we
it,
were able to cover a lot of ground. This was fun.
I know, try to just like go through it quick because I know you got a million other things to do. So I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Fun. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, just send it over whenever you're ready. But thank you for doing these. I mean, I know it's time consuming, it's a big lift, so appreciate it.
It's fun. I mean, again, like selfishly, I learn a lot through it. So
Yeah. Cool. Cool.
um,
Well, let me also know when you're in New York next.
I will. I was gonna ask you coming down to Miami at all or no?
Not in the immediate future. I not for the podcast, but I am having a baby in a couple weeks. And
Congrats.
so yeah, I right now am like I passed my travel deadline, like my travel cutoff. So I am grounded in New York for the time being, and I think this spring I'm gonna try to like limit most of my travel.
That's awesome.
But otherwise, like I love getting down to Miami. So
Well,
hopefully in the future.
congrats. That's
Thanks.
awesome. I'm excited for you. Hopefully you're able to take some time off and not continue grinding away at work. But
Yeah, I'll take a little bit. It's hard when you're self-employed and you have like a very small fund.
yeah, I know.
But yeah,
That's great.
yeah.
Well,
Awesome.
cool. I will let you get back to it. I'll clean this up. I'll
Sounds
shoot it
good.
over your way so you get final say. And yeah, if there's anything I can do to help in the future, I'll also shoot over a intro request to Ashley if that's cool.
Oh yeah, she's great. She Term Sheet just did a really nice announcement of her fund. And yeah, it's like a $13 million fund. It's not huge. But she has like an amazing slate of LPs, and she's like entirely focused on like developer tools. And came from like GitLab and GitHub, and she's just like I just think she's like really cool, and she has a very different perspective. So I would definitely, I think she'd be a good one to bring on.
Dude, awesome. Okay, yeah. I'll shoot stuff over your way. Cause yeah, I would love
Cool.
to meet her. This looks interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Talk soon.
All right. I'll see you,
Bye,
Zoe.
Clay.